St. Pete Beach. Today is Tuesday, June 4th, 2024. It is 1 p.m. Let's stand for the Pledge of Allegiance, please. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. City Clerk, if you'll please do a roll call.
Vice Mayor Lorenzen.
Here.
Commissioner Marriott. Here. Commissioner Phillips.
Here.
Commissioner Reznicki.
Here.
Member Panic.
Here.
Member Welch.
Here.
Member Stevens.
Here.
Chair Rothenberger.
Here.
Mayor Petrilla.
Here.
We have a quorum.
Thank you. All right, City Clerk, did you want to start with the audience comments reminder?
So there are no audience comments today during the meeting. However, I've submitted to you all the comment cards that we received either by submission on the online website through the form there and via email. We received no other comments or emails after the 1 o'clock deadline yesterday.
Thank you. And those can be accessed?
I can forward them.
I think it's just point number 2 on the...
Oh, the past materials that were non-staff member provided, that means by maybe a board member or by a member of the public, those are all accessible on the city's Just FOIA public records portal. And then you have the minutes from all of those meetings, and if you would like to review the agenda materials, that does include staff presentations. Those are available on the city's website.
Thank you, City Clerk. Okay, so this meeting came about because we've been working on the city beach ordinances now for, Jennifer, was it 2 years, 2.5 years, longer?
We're close to 3.
Since 2022.
Okay, we've been working on it for quite a while, and we thought we were getting close to a final draft last September, October. Didn't quite make it. Then there were some changes at the City Commission and on the beach stewardship, and so here we are. One of the things that we talked about when we scheduled this meeting was that we were not going to go back and rehash 2.5 years of materials that's been gone over meticulously. And we asked the city commissioners and the beach stewardship members to please go back, if you're new and you were not a participant in those previous meetings, to go back and review all that information so that we're all up to speed and on the same page. And so I just want to confirm that everyone here feels like they're up to speed on the same page so that we can proceed. Okay, great. Assistant City Attorney, I think you want to give us a brief summary of where we're at and then what we're going to be looking at today.
Yes. Thank you, Mayor. Matthew McConnell for the record. So that was a great introduction on where we've started, where we're here. I think there are 4 main items for discussion today, and then we can talk about how we want to deal with the proposed sea turtle lighting. Hopefully reserve about 10 minutes at the end of the meeting because I don't think that conversation will be very long. I have some suggestions there. But what we kind of got through at this point is, we're discussing cabanas and the rentals of those. We were discussing setbacks for the beachfront properties and setbacks from the mean high water line and setbacks from adjacent property owners. When it comes to the service area in general, we were discussing commercial permits, and then we were discussing whether the resorts should be required and what that number is when it comes to removing chairs on a daily basis or not. So those are kind of the 4 points that I need direction on, staff needs direction on in order to get this back to be a second reading, but first reading all over again. I'll default to the clerk there. Because Mayor, you kind of alluded to it in the commission meeting, there's a business impact statement that needs to be addressed, and that's going to be, I would anticipate between readings, probably 1.5 to 2 months in order for staff to prepare that. So yeah, that's kind of my summary.
Okay, thank you. All right, let's start with the first one.
So if we want to, and I included the clean version as well, which is probably easier for you all to read. Again, just going back to the summary, the reason why there's so many strike-throughs and underlines is because this really came about with commercial enterprises kind of taking over the public beach. There was a lot of discussion and complaints, and the commission decided that, hey, it's time to update our beach ordinance. So what we did was we took out regulations of beaches and other sections in the Land Development Code and Code of Ordinances and decided to put them in one chapter. So this also helps the sheriff's office in enforcing, our beach manager, Ayako, and city staff and code enforcement when it comes to enforcement. So right now, I believe we're on 95-21. But if we want to, we can look at language specifically, or we can just talk generally about how we want to deal with cabana services.
One of the conversations that we had last time, and I wanted to see if you'd made any progress on it, was, as I believe it was you, Mr. McConnell, mentioned that our current beach ordinance doesn't actually hold any teeth, doesn't have any teeth, because there are no prescribed consequences for violating the beach ordinance other than a letter of reprimand, which, again, has no consequence. And so you had proposed something along the lines of all of our other ordinances, so that, first violation, it's a letter, second violation is a fine, third violation is a revocation of privileges, whether it's a permit for having cabanas, whether it's a permit for alcohol or whatever else it is. So have you made any progress on that or looked further into that?
So I think the way you describe that is how I envision it. I haven't looked into it any further just because I see treating the violations of this code similar to how we treat every violation of every code. So the city, depending on the violation, short-term rentals is non-compliant, so there is no courtesy notice for those violations. But for any other violation, it will start with a courtesy notice like, hey, you're in violation of this, you have 10 days to come into compliance. If you don't, we will schedule it for a hearing and we will impose fines that way. If you don't pay it, we record it against your property, and I think that's severe enough. I can't speak on how they were enforcing this before. I do know that from prior city managers, the resorts, at least I was told, were not the issue, so to speak. It's more of, I'm sure you all have seen it, picnics being set up, yoga classes, things of that nature. But what I will say is when we develop the application itself, which we can always bring back to the beach stewardship or the city commission before final adoption, which will be an administrative application, we can include language in there about first strike, second strike, revocation for a year, and we can really kind of add to that application so people take it seriously and understand that if you do this without a permit, similar to our lobbyists, we'll give you a warning the first time. If we catch you again, you can't do it for 6 months. If we catch you, eventually to the point where, I don't know if you want to go as far as you can't operate in our city, but it's different because our BTRs are for brick and mortar establishments. And your random yoga teacher doesn't have a business establishment in the city, but she's still operating a commercial enterprise on our property. So it's going to be separate and apart from the BTR. So
So the questions on the cabanas today is what?
Well, we really got stuck on 9522. I did misspeak. When it comes to the transient lodging facilities and cabana services, because I would say 6 or 7 years ago, definitely in the time that I've been at the city, there was the commission banned alcohol on the beaches completely. And the only area that can serve alcohol on the beach that's permitted is these cabana services. So there was discussion related to, if residents want to grab a beer, how does that work? Do we do wristbands? Do we do cups? And that's kind of based on my review of where we left off. It was 9522.
Yeah, Michael.
Yes, thanks, Council. I have a question. Does that, it obviously includes the hotels, does it include the concessionaires on the beach who just have cabanas and are not connected to a hotel or a restaurant of any kind?
So as it's drafted right now, Mayor, if I may, it's only transient lodging facilities. So it would not, if you're operating a chair and beach rental, you should not be serving alcohol.
I think maybe what Mr. Welch is referring to is Upham Beach and then at Pastor Grill, those concession stands, but technically those concession stands are not on the beach, and they do have signs that say no alcohol beyond this point, which is then the beach.
Sure.
Thank you for that distinction. Yes, those are both controlled by leases too, so if we do need to, and they're our property, so if we need to make some tweaks, we can always do that as well.
Yes, sir.
I think there's a number of other areas that I would want to talk about, but not right now since we're on cabanas. But with regard to cabanas, I think right away there may be some confusion about the word cabana, because our definition in the ordinance for cabana is chairs that are not used for bar service. But in fact, when you really dig down, the city actually requires these cabana permits specifically where you are selling alcohol, and we call them cabana zones. And what we learned, for instance, at a recent meeting of a community meeting, was that one of the hotels, when asked, why are your chairs going so far to the property line, the hotel expressed, well, those aren't our cabana zone chairs, those are just our chairs for our guests. So I think there's a lot of confusion that when we say that we think we're making rules for the cabanas, we may not be making rules for the chairs, or may not be communicating that we intend to make rules for the chairs. So I think we need to be very careful and really think about what we even intend among ourselves first. Do we intend that the chairs don't go within a certain number of feet of the property line? And then if chairs are being bundled with a room, that means, or bundled with your resort fee, that means that there is someone already assigned to that chair. It's, quote, rented. So we, again, have to think about what we're really saying, because as we put in the ordinance, oh, it has to be rented, or before it's brought out, or any of these kind of things, we really have to understand, before we can expect an attorney to draft the language, we really have to understand what we mean. I don't want to even confuse you with more details, but that's the thought process here. There's a lot of discussion that needs to happen about a cabana versus a chair and the setback for each that I'd be happy to discuss, but I don't want to hold the floor down.
Well, I think that's part of the same discussion, is because we talked about setbacks from the high, from the water line and also from the property. And then we also talked about sprawling properties having dedicated access points in between. If you remember that conversation, right? So if you have a property that's, a mile long of property on the beach, that there would be certain access points in the middle that would separate the chairs from the sand and create a walk, kind of a path between the cabanas, chairs, or whatever we want to call them.
And just to remind people of the history, at one stage, people had believed on the commission or the beach stewardship that everyone was required to bring their chairs in at night, and so felt that they didn't need to start prescribing other rules, such as that Mayor Johnson at one point wanted to have 10 feet between every row, not column, but every row. Or, they came up with something, but it was all put aside based on the belief that there was a rule already to make everybody just wait till they needed a chair. We then later discovered that wasn't the case. And so, and we've also got a lot of feedback from the hoteliers that it's a hardship to bring all their chairs in every night. And expect a customer to have to wait with their family and kids to have those chairs brought out. So again, grappling with that question, what do we want? Do we want the chairs brought in every night? And these cabanas, by the way, are 2 chairs in one. So when someone says they have 650 cabanas, they mean they have seating for 1,300 people, plus chairs. Cabanas aren't chairs. So it's big numbers here.
Matthew, do you see 95.22 as discussing just the alcohol service area?
Well, it discusses other things because it talks about setbacks. It's really regulations for the transient lodging facilities. The only section that regulates that. It also bans plastic straws, talks about other things. So to Mr. Kurtzman's point, I do actually think it may be a good idea to distinguish and maybe just call it an alcohol service area and take out the word cabana, because cabana in the definition does include chairs and everything else.
Yeah, I think it would be good to make that
distinction
much more distinct and clear about the, because we may want to have different rules, and I think different rules currently exist for an alcohol service area versus just an area that has chairs. And I don't think if, if we're rewriting it, I don't think we want to start off with it being confusing to anybody.
No, and I actually think that in this section, we can also talk about cabanas.
Okay.
So I envision this section being the regulations specific to transient lodging facilities, which can include alcohol service areas, cabanas, setbacks, plastic straws, everything.
And so then, because this section talks just about transient lodging facilities, it wouldn't apply to if there was a condo on the beach that has beach in front of them, and if they wanted to contract with somebody to rent chairs, it wouldn't apply to them because they're not a transient lodging facility.
It depends on the condo, I will say, because there's some condos that allow for short-term rentals.
But if it was a condo that didn't,
But if it was,
a condo that doesn't allow for short-term rentals,
correct.
and they wanted to have somebody that rented chairs to their residents or anybody else on their beach, this section would not apply to them.
Correct.
Okay.
The way it's drafted right now, it would not apply.
Okay.
About alcohol.
But 95.4, which is a whole section for chairs, tables, and umbrellas, has a section that says any operation from a franchise to set up chairs, tables, umbrellas, or cabanas on or upon the sand beach requires a permit for the city. So that would pertain, I think, and I was going to ask if that pertained, for instance, to the hotels who have a cabana zone and then also are renting chairs. But I'm not sure that they also do have a separate permit for the chair zone, where then they're saying, hey, we can get closer to the 75 feet of the residential zone with their chair.
It's a good question. I didn't envision a hotel, because they do a lot through their BTR, which would include the chairs and the cabanas. I don't think we need to over permit. I mean, I think our biggest concern was people doing things that are not permitted and not asked for. So for the resorts, I do believe on the BTR, their chairs, because I know there are a few that have chair rentals and cabanas, that's all kind of permitted either through the state or jointly together at one time. But 95.4 would pertain to your hypothetical,
A
Commissioner.
non-transient lodging.
Correct, and in that, it gets interesting because some of these condos own down to the mean high water line, but just like you regulate single-family homes and other things, we're not saying that you can't do it. We just want to be aware of it so that we know that you're not violating our code or doing things without permission.
And then 95.4 would also cover the public beach areas up on Mompasa Grill and
Correct.
the county park area. Yeah, okay.
And I have heard a lot of comments about, to that point, distinguishing public and private beach. And it's really up to you. I mean, that's a whole different conversation if you want to do it. It's adding a definition. There'd probably be some separate regulations that would come before you. But it is something that at some point we should discuss at maybe a later meeting, is if we want to make that distinction. With the understanding that I'm not going to sit here and make that distinction with the opinion of title. I'm not going to sit here and look at deeds. I'm not going to do any of that. I'm simply just going to draft distinguishing language for public and private beach. And we'd have to set up a policy in place administratively for proof of ownership.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Mr. Stevens?
Just on that point, proof of ownership or permission of the owner of the property. For example, your condo is that you have a yoga teacher that does a yoga class. That person would have to get a permit, but they would have to represent that they have permission of the property owner to run that business.
Correct.
On private property.
Correct. Correct. That would be one, just like it's
Special event permit.
special events or even like dock permits. Sometimes you have to get a sign off on your neighbor. It would be a similar process where, in my opinion, the permit would be coming from the property owner, right? Hi, I own this property. I'd like to have a cabana service on my property. So at that point, you already know it's consented because it's being applied for by the owner.
I would just, like the yoga example.
The yoga example, correct.
Park here, walk through this path, I'm gonna do a yoga class, it's on private property, someone trips and falls, then they have a permit, but they didn't get permission and the property.
That could be part of our
should
administrative,
just make sure that
it could.
ownership of the property approves of any commercial business going on.
I agree.
Mr. Kurtzman?
Yeah, I think it's very important, though, to recognize the public beach question to the extent that we don't get in trouble with any customary use discussions. It was very helpful that the city clerk had provided something that I forgot that I sent in a couple of years ago to the city commission, which was about the tax maps and how the tax maps showed that the properties really only taxed the properties specifically to the marshland and not the actual sandy beach, which I felt at the time was consistent with the idea that the sandy beach was a public area. Then, in looking further at the information that we were all sent, and actually had my slide where I had a link, and I can't believe I forgot about it. And the link actually was to the 2019 meeting where the city commission at the time rescinded the customary use ordinance. And during that meeting, they told the public not to worry, that the beach is public and the beach will always be public. And they, at the time, settled, they did it as they were settling the Silver Sands lawsuit. There was some confusion as to what had to be done for that Silver Sands lawsuit that we don't have to go into, but the issue is that the public didn't know the whole story, and the more important thing is they were assured that the beach was public. I get particularly scared when I see a revised comprehensive plan that says now we have to make sure we preserve private property as an equal footing. It's not even just a regular thing, it's a whole chapter. So it's not just a footnote, it's a chapter. So that, in a way, could be telling people later down the road that they can come at us and say, hey, you've got to reserve our private property. We've got beach ownership. What are you doing, city? So I think we have to be really thoughtful of that as we consider these ordinances. And for that reason, I have looked at a number of the deeds. And one of the deeds that I saw, for instance, in their very application for cabana service, says that this deed, has an exclusion due to the right of the public to use the beach. And I'm not saying we shouldn't give the cabana privilege, but we need to recognize that the public has the right to use the beach, which means if that vendor then says, I need the city to start coordinating with this, which I saw in a letter, where they want to start enforcing boundaries and asking the police then to finish the job of keeping people off of their, quote, property, yet the deed says the public has the right to use the beach. I think that we as a city may be creating a situation where we're blocking any future customary use privileges, and we're blocking our residents and the public from using the beach. So I think that we have to think about that.
So if I may, Mayor, the beach is public. The question becomes how much of the beach? Because no matter where you are, you can walk down the wet sand, regardless of the property line, regardless of where you are on the beach. You can walk the entire 4 miles and no one can kick you off. That is public beach. Some areas have 100 feet. Some areas have 10 feet. So to that point, the beach is public. The question then becomes how much of the beach behind certain property owners are public.
I think if you watch the video from August 29th or October 29th, I think you'll see the context, because it was about rescinding our customary use ordinance, which obviously was about more than the state area, which already, by state law, we have the high water authority. Obviously, this discussion wasn't just what the state already provides. This was the customary use ordinance we were rescinding. So it had to be about more that we were assuring people about. But we could. I'm just saying we need to be cognizant of this issue as I think it's very important that we do make sure the hotels can do these things, and I hope that, rent the chairs and preserve decorum, but we just need to make sure that there's, no confusion as to that we're giving up the fact that this is a public beach.
Yeah. Matthew, can I ask you a question? For and to everybody's point, we're going to get stuck again in definitions here because we did this before, right? So back to the purpose of the ordinance, and I have old notes from 2 years ago right? And I think you have an intention, right? We're here to protect and preserve the front line of our barrier island, to protect the flora and fauna, and to promote safety and enjoyment to all, right? If that's, I'm not saying this is what we wrote, this is just some of the notes that I had, right? And to me, beach can mean many things, but if I see zones, there's like different zones within our beach. But everything west, and you can correct me, and I don't know what the zoning is. I know some zonings call it preservation, right? Anything west of the CCL line is a preservation zone, right? So, and we're trying to preserve what we call the beach, which is in this preservation zone. But within this zone, you have the wet beach, you know, which is west of the mean high water line. Then you have some dry sand, which could be publicly owned, it could be privately owned. Then you have some dunes, some vegetation. So there's a bunch of zones within this preservation zone, which we're lumping all under beach. And then we're inserting the word public beach, private beach, wet beach. The same with the cabanas, and the definition of cabana says no bar, but yet we call it cabanas. And we've already done all of this. Do we need to just tighten up our definitions so that the words match everything throughout the document so it doesn't get confused, or use something like preservation, or I don't know, call something and then define the zones, and whether it's privately or publicly owned, the purpose is that we're all here to preserve the area. It's the front line of the barrier island. This is why we're doing this, it's the front line for the whole city, right? So we're trying to protect it and for the enjoyment of all, whether it's private or public. Just like we have zoning for building, right? You have a house, but you have to follow rules. Well, you might own this preservation zone property, but you got to follow these rules.
I think we can. I've seen beach ordinances go as far as developing zones on the beach with a map.
Yeah.
So you have Zone 1, Zone 2, which may not be a bad idea for our beach because most of the resorts are right next to each other. Zone 3, Zone 4, and then you could distinguish the regulations appropriately based on what zone you fit in. The only problem is you think of like the Silver Sands, which is kind of there, which is a condo. You know, there are some areas where the zone may not be applicable to everyone in it, but this ordinance can be whatever you all want it to be. So just to circle back, we're going to distinguish alcohol service area from cabana service area, which I think is a great suggestion because they also have to get permitting from the Department of Business and Professional Regulation, and they have site maps and plans that need to go along with it. How do we feel about some of the setbacks here in like 75 feet? Some of these are carried on over from what we currently have.
Are those for the wet zone or for the chairs?
Those would be for the chairs, because the wet zone does not, the way it's written right now, you can't serve alcohol at these cabanas, so it'd be for the chairs. So it'd be for the cabana area, not the alcohol service area.
So the hotel that stated that their permit allowed, they're allowed to put chair, well, help me, because, you know, as a resident, I'll bring my chair and put it anywhere on the beach. A guest might bring a chair and put it anywhere on the beach, but a hotel that puts the chair out shouldn't put it within 75 feet? I'm just...
75 feet of the wet sand, which means the first row is 75 feet from the wet sand.
Okay, you're referring to the wet sand, not the...
Correct. Wet sand, mean high water mark.
Right.
We'll put all of them in there with, like we do with development orders as well. So it's setback from the wet sand. Can't be any closer.
So people who come to the beach should only have towels in that area, or just no...
This is specific to transient
Commercial-
lodging.
commercial business.
Yeah,
This is just for the transient.
correct.
So this is just talking about the way that they do business. And I think 75 feet from the wet sand is probably good. We also looked at 75 feet from the property line. Correct?
Correct.
Right.
It's abutting an existent. The way we have it now is straight from, I believe, what's in our code currently. It says existing residential use.
Okay.
So it wouldn't be from,
See, CCI, Silver Sands.
Correct. We did that specifically for Silver Sands, which I'm not going to bore you with the history there, but obviously that's where our comp plan, some of the language came from.
They're set at 75 right now.
From residential. I would say most resort. The thing is, you have to start thinking about it this way. Now that we're approaching this again, there's also been development orders and CUPs that have been approved that give access that isn't there, right, via easements and things that we're going to have to make sure we're not regulating against, right? They have to kind of be in conformity with each other. So it may make sense to have a buffer between non-residential as well when it comes to property lines.
Well, I think what we're talking about here is, at least in my mind, was 75 feet between property lines, right? Because if you had two hotels next to each other, even if they're separate brands, right, you don't want a wall of cabanas, right? That was part of the reason we had a 75-foot buffer from the property line, was so that we have, some empty space in between.
Okay.
But going back to the cabana area, how do we designate that? I think one of the conversations we had last time was that it could not extend any further than 75 feet from the CCL line. So that, or from the property line, so that it can't go all the way to the water, all the way 75 feet from the water, but rather just a small strip from the back of the property that would be close to wherever the existing bar is that's on premise anyway.
So you're saying a setback from the CCCL seaward?
I'm not proposing. I'm saying, like, how do we designate it, that cabana area, or the alcohol serving area, right? What I remember from the last commission meetings, last workshops, was that whether it's from the back of the physical property or the property line, going 75 or 100 feet towards the water, not to exceed, if the beach is super narrow and we've got a 75-foot setback from the wet sand, it couldn't exceed that point. But if there's 300 yards of sand, then it might be 75 or 100 feet from the back of the property. So just a narrow strip closest to the property where there might be a bar already where they're serving, and so they can have easy access back and forth.
I understand the question.
Because we're talking about designating a drinking area, right?
Correct. The alcohol service
So
area.
we should have a way of establishing the boundaries of where that area is.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
To your point, if you go to some of the existing resorts that have that, there are posts
Sure.
that mark that. There's got to be a rule. Maybe it's a Jennifer question. Do you know how that, I think where you're going, how was that calculated, or where the posts go to designate the wet or the alcohol area? Is there a formula?
There's not a formula. They apply for a permit, and then it goes with our technical review committee that reviews it and looks to match anything that's existing in there. And then once they give us the layout and it's 50 feet by 75 feet, they mark the boundaries, and then we just ensure that they stay within the boundaries that they're permitted to be in.
So the boundary now is approved by
every
city administration.
correct.
And the state.
Mr. Mayor, I think you're saying we should
State.
there should be a formula on how that should be
Correct.
calculated.
Yeah, that's part of the discussion that we're having tonight, this afternoon is, where do we have the designated alcohol area? Because we're talking about having a wet area and then non-alcohol area, and then the beach area. Yes, Mr. Kurzman?
Using the old slide, when they use postcard any example, they showed 75 feet to the residential because of the special exception, and then they had 25 feet to a regular property line, and then it showed 50 to the high water line, but that was where we were changing it to 75 feet. But then there was also a slide that Jennifer McMahon had shown us, where she had shown what in Santa Clara and another city had done, and provided that as an example. And I think at the time it offered to maybe model some sort of formula, but at the time the decision was not to do that because we were going to do the carry out, the chairs each time. And that's where maybe it still might be worthwhile to come up with that general formula to say, so that everyone doesn't feel that they're going to TRC and it's a negotiation, but that there's actually a standard that's been set.
Yeah, and I think that's part of what we're
saying.
looking to do, is to make sure that we set a standard across all the beaches so that we all know. Again, I mean, we've all been here, and they keep telling us they want a nice family-friendly environment, so if it's a nice family-friendly environment, we shouldn't be having alcohol everywhere on the beach, especially when I, as a resident, can't go and have a drink on my own.
Yeah, I hear you. I don't know if a calculation to me makes sense. I just think it's going to be, how do you calculate it? You know, are you doing square footage and then a percentage can be the alcohol service area?
Can we just do it just like with the other one? It's going to be 75 feet from, or up to 75 feet from.
We can, but in your example, you said that, you know, some people have smaller beaches. So then all of a sudden you're creating a situation where maybe they can only put one row of chairs.
Well, they wouldn't be able to put more than one row of chairs anyway, because they'll have the setback from the wet sand. So what I was saying is up to, not to exceed the setback from the wet sand. Right, so for some of them, it might be 100% of their area. For some of them, it might be 10% of the area. But just have it designated so that it's simple, so we don't have to do math or do any weird calculations where one person calculates it one way, another calculates it a different way, but simply say, hey, from this line backwards, we can have alcohol in this area for the full width, right, minus the setbacks on the left and right.
Okay, and you're saying that area would be 75 feet?
For example.
Okay, I see what you mean.
But no closer then, so if it's a shallow beach area, you give them a setback, then it could be no closer to 75 feet from the wet
From
sand.
the wet sand, yeah.
So you have to you're giving a back and a forward
So,
number.
take for example, from the back wall of the closest building, right?
Yeah.
75 feet, that's your alcohol serving area. If, to the point where it's 75 feet from the wet sand is only 65 feet, then you only get 65 feet.
Got it.
If you've got 300 feet, then you've got 75 feet of serving area and 225 feet of no serving area.
I
But
like
you can
simple.
use that for cabanas.
Yeah.
That actually, the more we
Simple's
talk about
better.
it, seems pretty
Yeah.
simple. Because it would be a not to exceed.
Yeah, so then we just have to establish which line are we using. So is there one line that is pretty consistent where we're not going to have a lot of conversations about, well, I'm measuring it from here, you're measuring it from there?
I think the first line that comes to line is the CCCL, although I will tell you, I've seen the CCCL in the middle of someone's backyard before. But obviously, we don't have to worry about them serving alcohol. I think we would have to look at the map. Florida does a good job of putting the map online, and maybe we just want to kind of see if there's any problem childs that we need to address.
Yeah, like dunes. If half of their 75 feet is sand dunes, now they got 35 feet or whatever.
Right.
So
Well, I mean, what we can do is we can have this as a starting point
Correct.
and look and see, and again, we're not dealing with 500 properties, we're dealing with 15,
Yeah.
right? And it wouldn't be difficult to say, okay, if we said 75 feet, here's who's impacted. If we said 100 feet, this is the impact area, right? But I think that might be a good starting point, and if the CCL line is not the right line, then maybe we'll look at something else. But I think the only one, you're probably thinking of Silver Sands as well, where their line is actually in half the pool.
Yeah.
So-
That one, and then we dealt with a code enforcement issue where, ironically, the CCCL was like 10 feet into their setback in their backyard, landward. First I've ever seen it.
Yeah.
I think that's a great starting place if there's a consensus.
I think that makes sense. When we're looking at that, can we also make sure that there aren't properties where the 75-foot side setback and a 75-foot side setback, you know, I'm not sure what the narrowest transient lodging property is on the beach, but if there's one that's, you know, 165 feet wide, 75-foot setback on each side would leave them, you know, a very narrow area. So I think we want to be mindful of that
I think that's a great point.
also when we're looking at that.
And I think my vision was to think that even though it's a setback, you could use, and I've seen this drafted in our code, you can use the setback to accommodate easements that right? So like if, for example, you've already granted us a 15-foot public access easement all the way down to the beach, that doesn't need to be outside of the setback. That can be within the setback. So you're not doing 90 feet, right? You can but yeah, I can look at that as well.
So is the vision that in that 75 feet, the public might be sitting, or what would be happening in that 75 feet?
I think that's the alcohol serving area.
I'm sorry?
That would be the alcohol. We're talking about designating a
The alcohol.
the alcohol.
But I'm saying in the 75 feet where it's not the alcohol, you have a setback of 75 feet from the property line. So in that 75 feet, what's happening there?
No chairs.
Depends on the, right.
No chairs, so
No commercial.
what is there?
We're not here to make a determination on customary use.
Yeah, well,
We're talking about no commercial.
I know what you're asking, and
Yeah.
we're not here to answer that.
now, you've been at the meetings where several of them have told you that feel free to bring your chairs and umbrellas and set them up.
Better that than in front of.
We have it all on camera, so. Yes, sir.
To Commissioner Lorenzen's point, while you're doing that, and it might be hard because the world has changed on the pictures from space, but where does the vegetation of the dune system end in that? Because you could get some bad behavior of doing this, where then they plow down the dunes so they can get more chairs into the alcohol serving area. So we just need to be mindful of the space and then dune protection that's there. And I know we are all getting the emails about seawalls, and I'll say the dune system is the seawall of the west, and the more that we can maintain those, it's going to keep water out when the storm comes, so we should keep that in mind when we're doing this.
Well, I mean, the dunes are protected, so if you were to go out in the middle of the night and bulldoze them, you're gonna have different issues than the city.
Correct.
Yeah.
Well, sure, but
See slowly over time encroaching, right? It doesn't have to be all at once,
Yeah.
like a bulldozer, but it could be riding their ATV, moving their chairs in and out over,
Right.
flattening it.
well, and there's a lot of properties that don't have dunes behind them, and that would certainly discourage them from ever wanting to be involved in any kind of a dune restoration program if they were going to lose their whole area of doing business, you know.
Through the CUP process, in many major redevelopments, they have to do a dune.
Right, but for smaller, you know, for hotels that don't have dunes and aren't doing anything, there's no, yeah, there would certainly be no encouragement for them to do anything with dunes if they're losing business area, yeah.
Mr. Kurzman?
Yeah, so if I got this right, that 75 feet also would not have the hotel's chairs. It would have any hotel's chairs for non-alcohol or alcohol.
Are you talking about the 75 feet from the water or from the CCL?
Either one, from the water.
Okay, from the water, there would be no activity at all, right? So 75 feet from the water, 75 feet from the north-south, east-west property lines, there wouldn't be any activity at all, right? Then we're talking separately about a designated alcohol-serving area for transient lodging only, right? And so the idea that we're talking about is having from the CCL line a certain distance, whether it's 75 feet or 100 feet, towards the water, right? That would be the alcohol serving area, and you would also have your cabanas or chairs or whatever else you want to call them in that area as well. And then beyond that area, if you have additional property line to the 75 feet from the water, you could then have chairs
How
that
about-
you do not serve alcohol at.
How about north-south?
Well, it would be your, you know, not all the properties are north-south, but I understand what you mean. So on the left and right side, you still have your 75-foot setback where there's no commercial activity, right? And that would include chairs and alcohol and everything else.
Okay, so then, thank you for the clarification. The other thing that was part of the discussion, I think it was the last meeting, July 28, 2023, page 35, in the discussion, there was a decision that wristbands were no longer appropriate, and also that there should be some sort of common signage that would delineate these zones. And so the ordinance doesn't have that change yet in the redlining. But then
I think the
question-
reason why
confirm that.
I think the reason why is because we actually, the conversation was opposite of what you just said. I think what nobody wanted, because of the customary use situation, public versus private, is have anything that is roped off or delineated in any other way, right? And so whether I don't remember if we stuck with the wristbands or not the wristbands, but there certainly needs to be a way to establish whether you're, but again, if you're in the alcohol serving area, you're in that area. If you're outside of that, it is the property's responsibility to make sure that you do not cross that area.
Yeah, I think the idea was that the wristbands were being often associated with, you shouldn't be here if you don't have a wristband, which is why we weren't comfortable with the wristband concept, especially because it wasn't for alcohol, because even the kids were getting these wristbands.
Right.
But then the border was useful from the standpoint of, shouldn't be a sign on the outside saying don't enter, but that it should be a sign on the inside saying don't leave with your drink.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's a different, if you look at a lot of the, again, Upham Beach, good example, Passer Grill, Undertow, a lot of the beach bars areas, they have a sign that says no alcohol beyond this point. I think the other issue with the wristbands is it might give somebody the impression, oh, I have a wristband, I'm allowed to have alcohol, I can be anywhere, rather than, yes, in this designated area. So I think, I think your point is valid, and I think that's what most of the other properties are doing, is beyond this point, do not, but there's nothing facing inward that says do not enter.
Right. So it sounds like what you want. It's similar to what's done at the other facilities.
Yeah, well, what we want to avoid is having any kind of barriers, right? Anything that might be in the future misconstrued as we're now waiving customary.
I do think that the 75, I mean, I've been kind of like letting it sink in. The 75 behind the property from CCL, I can tell you 2 hotels that we have all dealt with already, Serrata and Tradewinds. The renourishment of their dunes is greater than 100 already, just the dunes that we're asking them to replenish and with. So that means that their zone would have to be in the dunes. So do we add something to say, I'm almost wanting to put something to encourage to do the dunes, that if you were to, because we want that barrier, right? That's what we're trying to accomplish. So if hotels, businesses, whoever were to add this dune, at least 75, do we give them 20 on the opposite side of the dune for their alcohol zone? Because we're going to encourage them to keep the dune, not trample the dune like Mr. Stevens was saying, or slowly eat away with it because they're outside of that setback. So not to discourage them. I already know there's a lot of hotels who have dunes behind their property that's greater than 75 feet.
I think
That's why we
From the
kicked
CCL,
it back
sorry,
to,
from the
that's why we kicked it back to the staff and said, hey,
Yeah.
we're starting with 75 or 100 feet, whatever it is, look at those 15, 20 properties and come back with a recommendation of what the actual number that makes sense is.
that's why,
Or where we're measuring from. It might just be that you measure from the back of the dunes. Or I mean, I would say, maybe you say it's 75 feet from the back of the CCL unless you have dunes, in which case we'll give you 75 feet from the back of the dunes.
and that's exactly why I brought up the dunes.
And if you add your dunes, or heck, make it 100 feet if you have dunes, so that encourage them to.
Then you're dealing again with
But there's a lot of.
with the line that can move. And so
Yeah.
now you're making it difficult again to establish where the line is, right? So the last thing we want is to have dunes as boundaries, which, ask Europe, they use rivers as boundaries and it doesn't work, right? So, again, if we leave it to the staff to come back and say, look, here's the recommendation, it might be 150 feet, right?
Yeah.
Could be 200, I don't know what the recommendation is going to be, but certainly we want to take into account, okay, currently their dunes are here, and we should make sure they have at least 50 to 75 feet beyond the dunes, and so if that means they need 150 as a standard line, that's what it is.
Yeah.
Again, we still,
Let staff work it.
Easy enough.
Yeah, because I'm looking at the CCCL right now. I mean, it runs through a portion of the Rumfish, so it's different. But
For
I mean,
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know what that bright line rule, but I think what you're doing is setting parameters from chairs, alcohol, property.
right.
Right, that's
Yeah.
the vision I'm thinking that we're
The goal is to avoid a wall of beach chairs and to avoid beach chairs all the way up to the water.
Right.
Got it.
Mr. Kurtzman?
Something that might be useful as a tangible thing that the individual may change is the tax map. The tax map actually does show the property line to the marsh line, so to the beach side of the dune line. So that's sort of, they're paying taxes to the dune line, and you're saying,
To the CCL.
you're saying wait 70, and if the CCL is never going to be passed. I don't believe the CCL is past the dune line. or past the tax line. So, you know, if you're just saying 75, or just go ahead, 75 feet from the dune line, unless there's a CCL issue, but.
We can work on some language. I personally, I've seen too many discrepancies on the property appraiser's website. I mean, respectfully, they're not attorneys, they're not title. I mean, they just take information and create maps. Yeah. So I'm a little reluctant to trust everything you see on that website. Respectfully, I'm not a surveyor. I mean, if we're going to do this the right way, we're going to need to get professionals involved. So that could come forward at a future commission meeting.
I've got a question. The CCCL line does change over time, right?
Correct.
It has changed.
It has changed, which is why.
Is there a frequency?
I don't know the answer to that.
Okay.
Jennifer, do you happen to know what the currently with the hotels that have permits for chairs on the beach versus the alcohol service area? Do you know what commonly any of them have for side setbacks, or if there haven't been any side setbacks worked into the equation as you guys have been setting out those areas?
To my knowledge, the only side setback is to abutting residential,
Okay.
and that really only applies, I believe, to PCI.
PCI. Okay.
There's only one restriction, and it's 75 feet to residential, and then cabana area should not be closer than 50 feet to the wet sand is what's currently in the code.
Yep.
Okay, so currently the hotels have chairs up to the property, can have chairs up to the property line side to side?
Right.
Yep.
Okay.
And when we go through this and like you mentioned, looking at setbacks, we're going to look at everything just to make sure that the numbers are appropriate.
Yep.
So I have a question on 9522, 9521 B2. So we're talking about, what is the current time that they can serve alcohol in the designated alcohol serving area?
That language is directly, it's currently in our code now. So it is.
What's the time?
No later than 10 p.m.
Okay, because this one says special events or special permits.
Correct.
Okay.
It's in 6-5 now in our code, so that's one of the strike-throughs, but it's verbatim language that's currently there. Open to suggestions if we want to change that.
That's not for cabana service, that's for a special event, and it aligns with our noise ordinance.
Yeah, that's what.
So if like a concert was happening on the beach or the Bucks Bash or whatever,
Sure.
they can't go past 10 p.m.
I'm just thinking in terms of, in the winter, 10 p.m. is many hours past dark, right?
That's a good point, though. Should it be sunset?
Well, whether it's sunset or, a lot of other areas, it's, 5 p.m., 6 p.m., something coinciding with that area, because they're not serving food on the beach anyway, so it's not like people are sitting there having dinner and then, hoping to have a drink, but rather.
Well, so hotels will have to get a special event to serve alcohol on the beach. And so
Sure.
if they're having a reception.
Well, we're not talking about special events.
That's what 2521 is, or 9521 is that you're talking about.
Yeah, but that's what I'm asking is, I'm asking about whether this addresses the daily activities. And
No,
so
that's in 22.
So I want to talk about the daily activities, right? So what are the drinking hours?
So that currently in F says sunrise to sunset, right? In 9522F.
Correct. But again, read this with the assumption that we're going to make a distinction between cabana and alcohol service area, right? So F could say the alcohol service area hours. Right now, it's sunrise to sunset, because that's technically how long our beach and parks are open till.
Okay. Yes, Mr. Kurzman?
Yeah, the other piece of this, when trying to figure out the formula, and I've been trying to work on this through a FOIA request that I started at the beginning of April, is it's not just the cabanas or the chairs that take up space on the beach. And this is coming from the complaint that people come out and there's no place to sit. But there's zip lines that move, volleyball, slides, and just been trying to find out, what permits need to be obtained to get that. And I just thought that by finding out what permits have been obtained, I'd figure out what the rules were, because I couldn't quite tell what the rules were. I know I asked one time, and was told that only the DEP had to approve something like a zip line on the beach, not the city in any way. So I've just been trying to find out, what are the approvals? Because do we want, in the ordinance, again, I'm not trying to get beyond the cabana discussion, but it's about, like, I think the discussion is really about what do you want to have on the beach?
Right. No, and that's certainly a valid question. I mean, as we're currently discussing, we're talking about all commercial activities being 75 feet from, the water and the property lines. If we can get past this, then maybe we can also look at, whether because right now, am I correct in saying that those items are administratively approved rather than?
Depends. I believe the water slide was a CUP back in 2004 or 5, if we're talking about what I think we're talking about. I know anything that you do past the CCCL, whether we're involved or not, we usually are, has to also be approved by the state, period. So the problem with the state, and I mean this respectfully, when it comes to enforcing the dunes, when it comes to these things are rubber stamps. They usually rely on us to enforce even dune preservation, which I'm shocked by, because you should see some of the things that I see in code enforcement. So I wouldn't really rely on the state too much. I would focus on your own regulations.
Okay, so what you're saying is we should maybe have a second layer of protection where we have maybe something similar that mirrors the state guidelines, for example, for whatever activities on the beach, but then that allows us to enforce it as well.
Yeah, I would think our own, because no matter what you do, even if you're going to the county for a dock or the state for a permit, they're always going to say, has a local government approved this? So we get the first bite at the apple, if you will. So if our staff has regulations to look at and saying, okay, you've met these parameters, you're good to go, then the state just kind of rubber stamps it at that point. So I don't know if I would even adopt what the state does, because every city is different, our beach is different. But I think regulations, the clearer we could be, the better for enforcement purposes. But see, you just raised an interesting issue, like how does that play into their alcohol service area? I guess we'll find out, right? Because they have permitted water sports back there and activities that I guess we'll just have to work through.
Okay. Have we completed 21?
I think so. I had one very quick question on 9519 before we roll, and it's probably already covered in the turtle section, but it talks about residents closing blinds and that type of thing. Is there something that we're going to read later on that talks about residents turning off like backyard spotlights and all that kind of stuff?
Yeah, I try to reserve, even if it's 5 minutes at the end of this, to talk about the model sea turtle.
All right.
We can talk about it now real quick. I just think.
Nope, let's wait.
Okay.
Thank you.
So what we never.
I know this is a no.
I'm sorry, sir. We are not taking public comments. We were very specific about that, and I don't.
Two different seasons. There's summer and
Sir.
winter with two different sets of regulations.
Sir. Thank you.
All right, so we do the turtle ordinance.
Yeah. So just anyone that would like to discuss this further outside, feel free to reach out to me. My information's online. Happy to talk to you. So 95, one thing we have not addressed, which would be in this section too, is chairs. So before we move on, there's no language in here right now because most of you were there. The conversations were kind of back and forth, percentages, amounts of rows. We've all gotten public comment from the resorts and how they feel. I don't know if you want to wait to see how much area we're talking about. I think what makes the most sense is to allow staff to go or a surveyor, whatever it takes to kind of see, okay, what are we talking about when we have a 75-foot service area, 75 feet, how much area do you now have for chairs? Probably before you start regulating the amount of chairs. Because if you only have 75 feet, you may only have enough room for 3 rows anyways. just a suggestion.
Chairs or alcohol service area?
This is just chairs, which includes cabanas, you know, like the cabanas outside. There were talks about making them remove them nightly. Right now, the only time they have to move them pursuant to the code is, I believe, that if there's a sea turtle nest, they have to, there's parameters there. So that
I
was
think it
one of the.
makes a lot of sense to wait until we have more information about with the setbacks, we're talking about how much, like you say, how much area is being covered with chairs. Because at this point, to try to make any determination, you know, it seems like putting the cart before the horse a little bit.
Yeah, I went to each property after last July or August's meeting and went to each hotel and looked at the areas, looked at each of the beaches. I think we can work, if I can go back out and look at the setbacks from that, I know what our goal is, and I think we're pretty good. And with the exception of one, maybe two that have a pretty skinny beach, I think we can come back and have a good solution where we're not a wall of chairs. And a lot of them are already picking up the chairs and stacking them already. So since we've been discussing this for long, they've switched out what they have. There are a few that still haven't, but.
Well, I think those are two separate conversations. One is, you know, how much versus the other one is, do they come in at night?
Yes.
And we can certainly have that conversation.
Yep.
I mean, I know I've spoken with the company that does the chairs at Paso Grill and front of the plaza, and at the county park, and I think 9 other cities on the barrier islands. And their feedback is they already do it with 1 employee per location every single day in both seasons, really without any challenges. And I think if we're talking about, you know, I think the other part of the conversation was, do they put them out when they, you know, when they rent them out, you know, or do they just put them all out every morning and put them all back out every night? And I think there's a conversation to be had there. Maybe, you know, they can put up to half in the morning, and then the rest as they're sold, if they do sell them. Again, from the businesses that run the beach operations, I think what I understood was that they put out a certain number, but not all of them, because there's no point in putting. I mean, they might do so during spring break or on the weekends, you know, February to July 4th, you know, but for the rest of the year, they don't put out everything. Doesn't make sense for them.
Well, you're right, it's a two-part conversation, and I agree with Commissioner Marriott that as far as the space and that type of thing, I'd kind of like to let the city staff do their homework, and it's all part and parcel with the other issue we were talking about. The chairs, I'm more interested in listening to everybody on that one before I come up with an opinion.
I think, you know, as far as the chairs being brought in or out, there's a lot of variables per business. And I think there are some businesses that, you know, that are already bringing the chairs in because of the equipment they have and their business model that works for them. I think there are some hotels that have, you know, a different kind of structure where that's more difficult. And I think we need to be a little bit careful about lots of unintended consequences of bigger, heavier equipment moving back and forth in the middle of the day when the beach is more populated, and you know, creating a scenario that we weren't necessarily looking for with, you know, some sort of vehicle having to move chairs back and forth through a crowded beach, versus if they put more of them out early in the day, depending on, you know, their business model and what kind of equipment that they have. And so I'm not sure that there's a super simple one-size-fits-all answer to that question. And I think it also is going to depend a little bit on what the surface area that's covered with chairs looks like versus the empty beach. And it may be that when we see what those numbers are, that you go, well, in most of these cases, we're not concerned if these chairs are there all the time. Or it may be that you look at it and go, oh, I don't know, that's a lot more area than I thought it was going to be. Maybe we feel like we need to move the chairs. So I still think that's a question that will be better addressed once we know what the amount of space and the number of chairs that we're talking about looks like.
What problem are we trying to solve with the chair issue? I guess I'm at a loss on this. What's the threat? What are we worried about?
Well, if I may, Mayor, real quick. So just think about it this way. We have to do a business impacts estimate and statement. So when you're regulating this, not that you should be, it shouldn't be swaying your mind one way or another, but, if you start to impact businesses too much, that statement will be greater than if you don't, right? So I'll leave it at that. We have to think about how much are we going to impact businesses on the beach or not, because the greater that impact, I can already tell you, I've gotten calls from lawyers, expect this to be in court, and then we're going to have no regulations for the next 2 years, which I'm trying to kind of meet in the middle here, because I think there's a solution. But when it comes to the vendor, Mayor, that you mentioned, and all respect to him, all of the complaints we were getting were from him at the Dolphin Village, because he was putting out the chairs and he was taking up all of the public beach, allowing no one to sit. So we actually controlled that by taking over the lease from the county, adding him, and then controlling it via our lease agreement. So I can appreciate what he's been doing now and how he's accommodating. But I got a plethora of complaints about the public going out there and all the chairs being there and them having nowhere to sit. So that was a problem that we addressed because we control it.
Well, in the neighboring residential condo, what was happening is public was going to a public beach. There was nowhere to go. So then they headed south, and they were now on private property in front of condos. So those condos had a problem with the amount of cabanas that were on the public beach. So it was like we're just crowding over, and it's seeping into then private property. So that's, Rich, kind of where it's kind of twofold. Turtles, as Turtle Joe stated, and it was the crowding and being able to access our public beaches. So it's kind of two different things. We are in control over Upham and Casa Grill and the county beach now, with our vendor who is here sitting in the back. And we have a good working relationship, and he also does it for a couple other private and hotels on the beach as well. So he's flipped his model based on this conversation 2 years ago.
Thank you.
And I will say, he's done a great job.
Commissioner Fitz?
Yeah, I was going to just, before Jennifer spoke, I was going to say, I think with the problem trying to solve, one is the sea turtles, and correct me if I'm wrong, but with like false crawls and that at night. And then two is beach chairs sitting out that aren't being used, especially for consecutive days. Because what purpose does that serve? So.
Mr. Kurzman?
Yeah, I mean, the ordinance is written right now, so it's sort of hard to tell because things move, so everything looks added. But it does add the thing that it should be unlawful for any person placing or causing not to be placed any chair, bench, table, or umbrella upon the public and privately owned beaches to allow such to remain upon the beach between sunset and sunrise. So the draft does now have that removal item in it, which is why we've gotten so many objections. But, you know, the spirit of that is that, and we know that there's been hotels that have a large investment in big, heavy, you know, chairs or cabanas, but obviously there's going to be a recycle time, you know, just like with other things. But, you know, we used to have a sign up here that said Sunset Capital. I don't know where it went. And when you think about it, do you really want at sunset, you know, tractors or electric tractors dragging everything off the beach as people are taking their pictures, which is what's going to happen. So you just have to vision what's happening. I know we want to try to protect the turtles or make sure that they don't lay, you know, don't come up and lay their eggs where you don't want them to, or we want to make sure they lay them everywhere, I guess. No matter how dense the area is. I still wonder if there's any scientific study that says that maybe you want to just put up a barricade in certain really high density areas to let them know, no, don't lay your eggs here. This is the busiest part of the beach. Swim 50 feet that way and lay them there.
Then they lay them in the water.
No, they don't. I've been told they swim out and then they do try other spots. All
I've been told different. So.
Right. Well, anyway,
What are we
so
talking?
like I said, maybe the science has to, but But,
Well, again, those are things that you can address through the ordinances, because right now our ordinances do specify what kind of vehicles you can and cannot have on the beach, what size and when and where. And, you know, just like with our sign ordinance that hopefully we'll get to at some point, you know, you could have something simple that says, look, you've got 3 years to get into compliance, right? For example, right? So, hey, yes, you've got these heavy chairs. They don't last forever. You know, you've got 3 years in which, I'm saying, for example, it's the fact that it might take an extra line or an extra thought to make something happen shouldn't, you know, deter us from doing what is necessary to make sure that we do protect the turtles, the environment, that we, you know, combat the overcrowding that's on our beaches, so that we don't have, as the commissioner said, a wall of cabanas and chairs. You know, I spend a lot of time, you know, traveling, and we've been all over the world, and I can tell you the nicest beaches in the world, they all do this, and we keep saying that we're the best beach in the United States, maybe in the world, and yet we don't take any steps to protect that. We keep talking about, well, gosh darn it, it might be hard. Well, you know what, it might be hard to get a new sign for your small business on Gulf Boulevard, but it's not stopping us from doing what is necessary. Right now, we want to be cognizant of that, and we're going to take steps necessary to make sure that all the businesses can come into compliance. But I also don't want to have a conversation like, okay, well, this business gets this and this one gets this, just like we talked about the alcohol area. This is your designated area. This is easy for everyone to figure out and understand. This is where it is. No, everybody puts it in at night, or nobody does, right? We're not going to make up rules for one business and another, right? We've already seen from businesses that operate this type of enterprise that it can easily be done with one employee. And so I don't really see where the challenges are for businesses that have, as they tell us, 500 employees, right? And we're talking about half an hour in the morning, half an hour in the evening. So we're talking about, what, an expenditure of $100 for your business impact study, right? I mean, as we're looking at these things, we're not talking about a huge financial impact on
for us.
No, as we're looking at the financial impact studies, what happens if we push this ordinance forward, right?
well,
Again, just because there may be challenges it shouldn't preclude us from doing what is right. And what is right is protecting the environment and protecting our beaches.
okay. And I'm glad you mentioned the electric vehicle also, because I was hoping to
We're not talking about bicycles on the beach today, John.
You actually wrote a very good letter about electric bicycles when I read the minutes. And
Yeah.
I do hope we get to electric vehicles in general, though. Because
Probably not today.
In January, it said January of '26, you know, everything has to be electric. And
Certainly.
obviously, you want to phase that in. You don't expect everybody to buy all new vehicles in 1 year. And I do hope you do go back and read your letter, though, about electric bikes, because I know a lot of people came to me about electric bikes also. And we should, I think, talk about that at some point as we go down these ordinances, but not necessarily today.
Right.
Mr. McConnell,
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
how, the impact statement, where does that fit in with what we're trying to do to finalize the ordinance?
I think to the mayor's point, you have to focus and feel confident with the regulations that you're proposing, in an interest of everyone in the city, in East City, public wealth and benefit of every citizen and business owner, and then just let staff determine how to, I mean, I don't even know where to start, I'll be honest with you. We haven't had to do one like this. There's going to be businesses, especially, that we're going to have to figure out numbers on. But to the mayor's point, I wouldn't let it impact what you're doing currently, right? Because you guys all know me. If we're doing something we shouldn't, I'll tell you. So, you know, don't let it hinder the conversation.
All right. We have 2:15.
I think personally we've gotten through the four things I wanted to. I think you're going to have to give staff time. I don't know who the point person is going to be here. I may actually add something to a future commission meeting about, I think we have a surveyor. But if we're going to do this, I just feel legally we should do it the right way and get experts involved if needed to kind of delineate where this area is going to be. The next thing on here is a model sea turtle ordinance. I didn't want to spend too much time on it because I have a suggestion to make on how to handle this. So in our beach ordinance, we carried over very, very limited language on sea turtle protection. I personally think that there's already enough going on in this beach ordinance. I think that if we address sea turtles in their own importance, because they are important, that we should do it separately. I don't think that ordinance should hold up this and vice versa. So my suggestion would be to allow the beach stewardship to work through the model beach ordinance when it comes to sea turtle lighting. I believe there's something additional with shark fishing too, which we can add to an agenda. But I haven't reviewed this model ordinance. I don't know the legality or sufficiency of it, but I just, in an interest of time, think that's a perfect project if they're willing to allow the beach stewardship to just kind of work on that separately from what we're doing now.
I think that's a great suggestion. When is the next meeting?
For the beach stewardship?
August.
We can schedule us,
We can,
yeah.
Yes, sir.
Question, could we move that up? Could we have a special meeting to do it?
Yep.
I would definitely be behind that, for sure.
Maybe city clerk, would you mind setting up one of your polls? Yeah. Thank you.
So with that being said, we have 14 minutes.
I've got a couple comments.
Yeah, please. I'm sorry, Mayor, I don't know who you want to.
Commissioner.
Yeah, so just something resident brought up to me about adding tiki torches to prohibited items. Like, it's been an issue.
I don't know that they are.
I don't know if they're in there or not.
I think we have.
I don't think they're allowed.
Flame
No
written,
open
do
flame.
you remember?
I just know right now you can't have fire on the
John might remember.
beach, but
can't build a fire, but
They-
if we change it to
allow 'em.
open flame,
Right.
Yeah.
change it to
it
a-
can solve the problem.
Yep.
I don't,
What about lighters
Yeah.
for cigars, which the state allows?
I know.
Right.
Makes zero sense. Tiki torches, great idea.
Okay.
To prohibitions, correct?
Yes.
Yeah, I think, open flame sounds reasonable. Mr. Welch?
It's really pertinent that we get a position that allows us to restrict by licensing any business that's on the beach, period. Whether it's commercial fishing or it's launching large flotilla from the ramp. And it is, there's more of it that goes on the beach. I mean, I walked down Saturday night, there were 10 commercial things going on. We should have the power to allow or not allow.
So what is our current,
The only thing current in our code is you cannot exchange money on the sandy beach. That's it. And
And solicit.
and solicit. So, and we talked about this in other workshops. I suggest we treat it kind of hybrid, but similar how we would do a class, because a lot of them is recreational things, like we do at our rec center, and treat it, or like our park, our beach is like a large park. And if they're an instructor on the beach, we do our instructor backgrounds, we do a contract, we get their insurance, and we have some ability to control, similar how we're talking about with the boat ramp. And within that, we could say we're only going to allow 2 yoga classes on our beaches at any given time. And we could set parameters or say we don't want any, but I think we want people to
Oh, yeah.
do activities and things that are cool on the beach, but I think we have no control over it right now, and I am a control person.
That's why we're here.
And so that's what I would suggest, that how we're kind of handling the boat ramp, and this is how we've been talking about being able to have it done as an annual process. And so if you are doing picnics, they know they can't have alcohol, they know they can't do this, and they sign off that they can, and then if they do, guess what? You're not going to do it anymore.
Well, it's also the inconvenience of the citizens and the visitors to the beach to have a commercial venture come in and take up space. That, I mean, that they're there as a business. Don't we license businesses on the beach? Can I open a store tomorrow without a license? How can I open a business on the beach without a license?
You can open a business as long as you exchange the money somewhere else and not on the sand, right?
Yeah.
I said you can have a business as long as you exchange the money somewhere not on the sand.
Yep.
So what we did with the boat ramp, though, we created a permitting, right? And so, again, going back to Matthew's the earlier conversation we had, 1, 2, 3 strikes, the ability to revoke permits, have the ability to control that, so that if you have a bad actor, we have the ability to put an end to it. So maybe we can do something similar along those lines, where if you want to do something on the beach, it requires a permit.
Yeah, the only business we do have is beach weddings.
Is what?
Beach weddings. That's the only thing currently that we do a permit for.
Oh.
Or if there's a film commission, or if people are doing a commercial or filming something, it goes through the county and then we approve that. That right now is all that we kind of have control over. We took over, the beach wedding permits changed immensely, where we're only allowing so many, it's at any given day, probably 8 years ago, and then charged from $20 to $250. So
Yeah,
it's the only business on the beach right now we make money off of.
Well, I just think that I already made a note to add commercial activities to the definition, but, I like bright line rules, but we may need to think about some exemptions here, because I'm just thinking of your, everyday yoga teacher. She probably doesn't have insurance. I mean, do you want to limit that activity altogether in our parks too? I mean, I think we need to start thinking, how limiting do we want to be? The complaints I've gotten are the picnics, because they take up a lot of area. Yoga teachers, it's usually an hour class, it's over, and everyone's gone.
Yeah, they have insurance.
They're out of there by now.
Well, I'm just we may have to make distinctions on, when we define commercial activities, what level of requirements we're gonna.
I think you're exactly right. At Upham particularly, there's a lot of commercial activity happening, but it's across a really broad spectrum, right? Because there's, a local photographer who's one person out there with a family doing family photos on the rocks. And then there's also, a company doing a bikini photo shoot with a pop-up changing room on the beach and 4 photographers and 3 people carrying lights and 5 wagons full of camera gear. And those are two very, those are both commercial activity, but they're different levels of commercial activity. Matthew, is there any, I think that as we go through this beach ordinance, and I know one of the things in the beach ordinance is licenses for businesses who are doing business on the beach and those sorts of things. But between that and the working out the parameters for the chairs and the alcohol service areas behind the hotels, is there any benefit in doing this in kind of 2 stages? I'm thinking about this and wondering if we will have a better chance of actually getting something done and starting to be able to implement some of these things if we can do it in a couple of chunks versus having to get all of these things from every direction completely finalized before we can pass the ordinance and have any way to manage any of it.
Short answer is yes. Can absolutely bifurcate, or, once you establish the chapter, then you can amend it via 2 readings at any time. So we can do that. You can focus on, we're doing the sea turtles separate, but you could say, we're going to save cabanas for the next version, or we're going to save commercial permits for the next version. It's really up to you all.
Yeah, I don't know if anybody else has any thoughts about that. I feel like this is so big, and there's so many different directions that the conversation goes, and so many different kinds of businesses that it affects, and especially now with the economic impact statement, that it would be really great if there was some chunks of this that could actually happen. And I don't know if there's any, I don't know if anybody else has any feelings about the best way to move forward with some of that.
I mean, we're 99%, 95% done here. I think we just need to get it over the finish line at this point. I mean, unless anybody else sees anything huge that we're missing, I think where we're at this point is we've left it to the staff to go back, do some measurements, come back with a few recommendations, and we're basically done. And so I'm not sure why we want to overcomplicate it. If there's something that pops up, we can always address it later. Again, same way, 2 readings, right? If there's some glaring omission or something that has unintended consequences, as some of you have mentioned, we can address it. But at this point, we're so close to the finish line, let's carry it over the finish line. Let's let the staff do what they need to do in the next 30, 60 days, however long it takes. Come back to the commission with those recommendations. We can then have a first reading, we can have a second reading, and have this thing wrapped up. Mr. Kurzman.
The only things we discussed today were cabanas, setbacks, commercial something or other, and removing chairs, and then kicking the turtles to the corner, so to speak. And I think we have some
That's
things
not-
in the corner.
Well, because we already, that's
I
because
thought you'd
we
be
already,
happy. I'm
it's
getting
because
worried.
we already covered everything else previously.
Yeah, that's
I
not-
don't believe that we have. I just, shelved any discussion on any of those items because you asked the agenda be these 4 items. There are a number of different items if you go down the actual ordinance. Maybe we should just, and I think this is a really very good idea, and there's a number of complaints from people saying this is too much at once. 3 minutes to talk about all of this. So maybe there should be an ordinance that simply focuses on cabanas, setbacks, chairs, and where you can have them.
Yeah.
That's what we discussed today. That is a bite-sized thing to come forward and put in section 95. To start now getting into
But we're
all these
not,
other topics that are in here that are moving and you can't even tell what's changing is way, way out of scope from what we discussed today. And I know I haven't even had an opportunity to raise any of those issues.
I think if we were talking about simply just updating a few sections of different ordinances, but what we're talking about doing is our entire code is stripping things out of it and creating a separate chapter just for beach ordinances. And if we start doing those things, then we haven't actually accomplished what we're trying to accomplish.
Well, the problem was they made changes as they were moving them. So it's not just a move.
Well, the
It's a
changes,
move and change, and you can't tell what changed and what was only because it moved, because everything looks new.
well, I've got a red line version and I've got a clean copy.
But the red line version simply says it was deleted from, chapter 48 and added to 95. So
Yeah,
what
but
changed and what
if
didn't
I may,
change
Mayor,
is all shown.
very
here.
simple. Everything's underlined that's being moved, correct?
Yes.
But look at the language. If it's struck through, it's changed. The language of the section.
No, so what happened is you deleted everything in section 48 because it was deleted there, and you underline everything in 95 because it was added, but what was added in 95 doesn't match what was deleted in the older section. So unless I sit there, which I have, and compare the language, I say, oh, look, they took out 2 of the dune protection items that used to be in there. Now we're not going to protect the first 5 feet of the dunes from mechanical machinery. Oh, look, they changed this. All these other changes are in there because as it moved, it changed.
It
You
did
can't see the
change
changes.
based on the workship in the commission and the beach stewardship that gave us direction as we moved through
It
these.
didn't, I raised this issue then, it didn't accurately reflect. Whenever you negotiate a contract with red lines, you can't just delete 10 pages and write a new 10 pages and say, see, it's redlined. You have to actually only change the words so people can see what changed, and that didn't happen.
So I think we've gotten direction. Personally, I think to your point, I've listened to all of your comments. I've sat through 20 hours of meetings. I've read your PowerPoint 7 times. I don't know how much we can really discuss some of these things that have already been agreed on. To the mayor's point, it can always be changed. It's not forever. I can guarantee you it's way better than what we have now, and that's what the focus should be. Let's get some of these things addressed. If we need to split it, we can. But personally, I've been dealing with this since 2022, and I'll work on it for 3 more years if you want me to. But I think at some point we have to pull the trigger on something.
Why not just pull the trigger on Cabana, since that's what we focused on today and are ready to maybe
Well,
pull the trigger on?
We have 1 minute left, so here's maybe a compromise solution, right? We've given the staff direction. There's nothing that says we can't schedule a 1-hour
joint workshop, maybe July, August, after we come back with the information, prior to a first reading. And then maybe at that point, if there's any individual items that anyone has from the beach stewardship or from the commission, if you want to send them to the assistant city attorney and said, here's some items I'd like you to take a look at prior to the workshop, we can do that. And then we can have one more short workshop where we go over the items we requested today. And then if we're ready, we can send it to the first reading.
Sounds great.
Okay. Unless there's any,
To clarify, I think you had asked Amber about the first reading, or whether it's supposed to be a second reading, what it means, because you
I
all...
think we've made so many changes, we might as well treat it as a first
So
reading.
there's nothing we have to do because
No,
of prior...
it needs to be a.
We're 2 years removed from first reading.
Yeah, no, we're starting over.
All right, thank you everyone for coming. We are adjourned.
Well done.